Brandon Miller stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Vancouver mansion, gazing at the manicured gardens below with the same calculating precision he applied to every aspect of his life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn, but even the warmth of daybreak couldn't penetrate the cold efficiency of his decision. He checked his Patek Philippe watch, 7:45 a.m. In 15 minutes he would propose a business deal that would solve his legacy dilemma once and for all. No messy relationships, no emotional entanglements, just a clean, contractual arrangement. The quiet padding of feet against marble floors announced her arrival. Sophie Turner moved through the study with practiced efficiency, her long brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pristine. She began dusting the shelves of leather-bound books, unaware that her employer's steely gaze had shifted from the window to her reflection. "Miss Turner." Brandon's deep voice cut through the silence. "A moment of your time?" Sophie turned, her green eyes meeting his with that directness that both irritated and intrigued him. Unlike the countless employees who cowered under his authority, she had never shown fear. "Of course, Mr. Miller." He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, her spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Brandon took his time settling into his own chair, arranging the contract papers before him with methodical precision. "You've been working here for 2 years now," he began, his tone businesslike. "Your service has been exemplary." "Thank you," Sophie replied, her voice carrying a note of wariness. In 2 years, he had never offered personal feedback. Brandon leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Turner, one that would be mutually beneficial." He pushed a thick envelope across the polished mahogany surface. "Inside you'll find a contract and a cashier's check for $5 million. Sophie's composure cracked for the first time, her eyes widening as she stared at the envelope. "I don't understand." "It's quite simple," Brandon continued, his voice steady. "I need an heir. You need financial security. This arrangement would provide both." The color drained from Sophie's face as understanding dawned. "You want me to carry my child," he finished, "through artificial insemination. The contract stipulates full medical care, a private wing in this house during the pregnancy, and complete confidentiality." He paused, studying her reaction. "The $5 million is yours upon signing, another 5 upon successful delivery." Sophie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope, but her voice remained steady. "Why me? You're healthy, intelligent, and discreet. Your background check was impeccable." Brandon's response was practiced, clinical. "More importantly, you understand professionalism. This would be a business arrangement, nothing more." Sophie opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the first page of the contract. Brandon watched as various emotions flickered across her face. Shock, indignation, consideration. He knew about her family's struggles, her mother's medical bills, her sister's college tuition. He had chosen her precisely because she couldn't afford to refuse. "And after?" she asked, looking up from the papers. "What happens after the baby is born?" "You would be free to live your life as you choose, with enough money to ensure you never need work again." Brandon's tone was matter-of-fact. "The child would remain with me, as my heir. Your involvement would be complete." Sophie's jaw tightened. "You really think everything can be solved with money, don't you, Mr. Miller?" "Money solves what needs solving," he replied coldly. "The rest is unnecessary complication." She stood abruptly, the contract clutched in her hand. "I'll need time to think about this." "You have 24 hours, Brandon stated, rising as well. "I trust you understand the need for absolute discretion regarding this conversation." Sophie's green eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, or perhaps pity. "Of course, Mr. Miller. I understand perfectly." She turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured and controlled. "Miss Turner," he called after her. She paused but didn't turn around. "This arrangement could change your life." "Yes," she replied softly, still facing the door. The question is whether it would change it for the better. As the door closed behind her, Brandon returned to his window, his expression unreadable. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Yet something about her response, that subtle defiance, that unspoken judgment, left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite define. He pushed the feeling aside. Emotions were messy, unpredictable things that had no place in his carefully ordered world. This was business, nothing more. And Brandon Miller had never failed at business. But as he watched Sophie cross the gardens below, her head held high. Despite the weight of his proposition, a tiny crack appeared in his certainty. For the first time in years, Brandon Miller wondered if perhaps there were some things money couldn't control after all. Sophie's small apartment in East Vancouver felt suffocating as she paced the worn carpet. The contract from Brandon Miller spread across her kitchenette table. The orange glow of sunset filtered through her window, casting long shadows over the pages that could change her life forever. Her phone buzzed again, the fifth call from her mother in the past hour. Sophie let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly what the message would contain. Another update about the mounting medical bills, another apology for being a burden, another attempt to hide the pain in her voice. $10 million, Sophie whispered to the empty room, testing how the words felt on her tongue. The amount could solve everything. Her mother's medical expenses, her sister Lauren's college tuition, the crushing debt that kept her awake at night. Yet the price tag attached to that solution made her stomach churn. She picked up the contract, again her eyes catching on specific phrases. Artificial insemination, full-term pregnancy, relinquishment of parental rights, non-disclosure agreement. Everything was spelled out in cold, legal terminology that reduced the creation of life to a business transaction. The knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Lauren standing there, her college textbooks clutched to her chest. "Mom called," Lauren said, stepping inside. "She's worried because you weren't answering." Her sister's eyes fell on the scattered papers. "What's all that?" Sophie sank into a kitchen chair. "Sit down, Lauren. I need to talk to you about something." As Sophie explained Brandon's proposition, she watched her sister's expression shift from shock to disbelief to careful consideration. Lauren had always been the practical one, approaching problems with logical precision that reminded Sophie, uncomfortably, of Brandon Miller himself. "So let me get this straight," Lauren said finally. "Your billionaire boss wants to pay you $10 million to have his baby through artificial insemination? No strings attached?" "No strings except carrying his child for 9 months and then walking away," Sophie corrected, running her fingers through her hair. "Living in his house, following his rules, being treated like some kind of breeding machine." Lauren leaned forward. "Soph, do you know how many people would kill for this opportunity? This money could change everything for us. Mom could get the best treatment available, I could finish school without drowning in debt, and you could finally pursue your dreams instead of taking care of everyone else." "By selling myself?" "By making a choice," Lauren countered. "A practical choice that helps everyone." Sophie stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "You should have seen him, Lauren. The way he presented it, like he was proposing a real estate deal, like creating a life was just another business transaction." "Isn't that better?" Lauren asked quietly. "No messy emotions, no complications. Just a clear arrangement where everyone knows where they stand." Sophie turned to face her sister. "And what about the child? What about bringing a baby into the world just to fulfill someone's need for an heir?" "The child would have everything they could ever want," Lauren pointed out. "A father who can provide every opportunity, every advantage." "Everything except warmth," Sophie muttered. "You haven't seen how cold he is, how controlled. He treats his mansion like a museum and his employees like furniture." Lauren was quiet for a moment. Sometimes the people who seem the coldest are just the ones who've been hurt the most. Sophie shot her sister a sharp look. "Don't try to psychoanalyze Brandon Miller. He's exactly what he appears to be. A man who thinks money can buy anything, including a child." Maybe, Lauren conceded, but that doesn't change the fact that this opportunity could save Mom's life. Are you really willing to let your pride stand in the way of that? The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, her fingers tracing the edges of the contract. What kind of person does it make me if I say yes? A survivor, Lauren replied softly. Someone who's willing to make hard choices to protect the people she loves. Sophie's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from the hospital's billing department. Another reminder, another deadline, another mountain she couldn't climb on a housekeeper's salary. She thought of Brandon Miller standing in his study that morning, so certain of her acceptance, so confident in the power of his money. The memory made her blood boil. And yet, wasn't he right? Wasn't she going to prove him correct about everything having its price? I need to be alone, Sophie said finally. Lauren nodded, gathering her books. At the door, her sister paused. Soph, whatever you decide, I love you. But just remember that sometimes the right choice isn't the one that feels good. Sometimes it's just the one that hurts the least. After Lauren left, Sophie sat in the growing darkness, the contract a white ghost on her table. She thought of her mother's brave smile in the hospital bed, of Lauren's determined face as she studied late into the night, of the dreams she'd packed away one by one as reality demanded more sacrifices. Finally, she reached for her phone and typed out a message. Mr. Miller, I accept your proposition. I'll sign tomorrow morning. His response came instantly. Excellent decision, Miss Turner. 9 a.m. sharp. Sophie set down her phone and walked to her bedroom. In the mirror, she studied her reflection, wondering if she'd recognize the woman who would emerge on the other side of this decision. Then she began to pack, methodically folding away the last pieces of a life she was about to leave behind. As she worked, she made herself a promise. She would do this on her terms. Brandon Miller might own the contract, but he wouldn't own her. She would take his money, give him his heir, and walk away with her dignity intact. It was just business, after all. But as she lay in bed that night staring at her ceiling, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that nothing involving the creation of life could ever be just business. And despite her resolve, Sophie Turner couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into something far more complicated than either she or Brandon Miller could possibly imagine. The morning of the insemination procedure dawned cold and gray. Sophie sat in the pristine waiting room of Vancouver's most exclusive fertility clinic, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The past week had been a whirlwind of medical screenings, legal paperwork, and carefully orchestrated appointments, all arranged with Brandon's characteristic efficiency. Everything is ready, Miss Turner, Dr. Patricia Chen said, emerging from her office. We've received Mr. Miller's sample and all your preliminary tests look excellent. Sophie nodded, following the doctor down the sterile hallway. She'd expected Brandon to be present at the clinic, if only to ensure his investment was properly handled. His absence spoke volumes about how he viewed this arrangement. Purely transactional, no different from signing property deeds or corporate mergers. 45 minutes later, it was done. Sophie lay on the examination table, staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd just agreed to. Dr. Chen had advised her to rest for a few minutes before leaving. Your driver is waiting outside, the doctor mentioned, checking her chart one final time. Mr. Miller has arranged for you to move into the mansion today as per the contract. Of course he had. Brandon Miller's world operated on precise schedules and immaculate timing. Sophie closed her eyes, remembering the clause in the contract. Upon completion of the procedure, she would immediately take up residence in the east wing of his mansion, where a full staff of medical professionals would monitor her potential pregnancy. The sleek black SUV waited exactly where Dr. Chen had indicated. The driver, a stoic man named Richards, held the door open without a word. Sophie settled into the leather seat, her small suitcase beside her. The rest of her belongings would be delivered later, not that she had much to bring to a mansion that already contained everything money could buy. As they approached the estate's gates, Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Meeting ran late, Mrs. Henderson will show you to your quarters. Dinner at 7. Not even a question mark at the end. Just another command from the man who now essentially owned the next 9 months of her life. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper Sophie had worked alongside for 2 years, waited at the mansion's entrance. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but Sophie could read the questions in her eyes. "This way, Miss Turner," Mrs. Henderson said formally, leading her through familiar corridors that suddenly felt foreign. "Mr. Miller has arranged the entire east wing for your comfort." The wing was larger than Sophie's entire apartment building. A master suite opened onto a private garden, complete with a meditation area and heated pool. The attached sitting room contained a library of pregnancy books, a state-of-the-art entertainment system, and a desk with a laptop. "Your medical team will arrive tomorrow," Mrs. Henderson explained, gesturing to another door. "The doctor's office and monitoring equipment will be set up in here. Mr. Miller has arranged for the best specialist in Vancouver." "Of course he has," Sophie murmured. "Heaven forbid his investment be anything less than perfectly monitored." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "This situation is unusual for all of us, Miss Turner. But Mr. Miller is a businessman protecting his interests," Sophie finished. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Henderson. You don't need to explain him to me." The housekeeper nodded, hesitating before adding, "Dinner is served promptly at 7 in the main dining room. Mr. Miller expects punctuality." After Mrs. Henderson left, Sophie explored her new domain, running her fingers along expensive furnishings that felt more like a luxury hotel suite than a home. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly impersonal, just like Brandon himself. At 6:55 p.m., Sophie made her way to the dining room, having changed into a simple black dress she'd brought for formal occasions. Brandon was already seated. At the head of the massive table, his attention focused on a tablet propped beside his plate. "Good evening, Mr. Miller," Sophie said, taking the seat to his right, the only other place set at the 12-person table. Brandon looked up, his dark eyes assessing her with clinical detachment. "Miss Turner, I trust everything is satisfactory with your accommodations." "The golden cage is beautiful," Sophie replied, unfolding her napkin. "Though I'm surprised you're allowing me to dine with you. Wouldn't it be more efficient to have my meals delivered to my wing?" A muscle ticked in Brandon's jaw. "Despite what you might think, I'm not a complete autocrat. Regular meals together will allow us to discuss any concerns or needs that arise during your pregnancy." "How considerate," Sophie murmured as the first course arrived. "And here I thought you'd simply have me fill out procurement forms for any requests." Brandon set down his fork, fixing her with a stern look. "This arrangement will work better if we maintain professional courtesy, Miss Turner." "Professional courtesy?" Sophie met his gaze steadily. "Is that what we're calling it when a man pays a woman to carry his child and then dictates every aspect of her life for 9 months?" "You signed the contract willingly," Brandon reminded her, his voice sharp. "No one forced your hand." "No, just my circumstances." Sophie took a sip of water, noting how his fingers tightened around his own glass. "But you're right, Mr. Miller. I did sign willingly. I just wonder if you've considered that babies don't read contracts." Brandon's expression hardened. "Meaning?" "Meaning that your careful plans, your schedules, your controlled environments, they might work in real estate, but a child is different. You can't manage a baby like you manage your properties." "I'm well aware of the differences," Brandon said coldly, "which is why I've arranged for every possible contingency, including the best medical care money can buy." Sophie sat down, her fork suddenly tired of the pretense. "Why me, Mr. Miller, really? There are plenty of women who would jump at this chance without asking questions. Professional surrogates who wouldn't challenge you or make uncomfortable observations. So why choose someone who clearly irritates you?" For a moment, something flickered in Brandon's eyes, something that looked almost like uncertainty. Then, it was gone, replaced by his usual mask of control. "You're direct, Miss Turner, honest. You have no hidden agendas or social climbing aspirations. Those qualities make you ideal for this arrangement." He paused, studying her face. Your tendency to speak your mind while occasionally challenging is preferable to sycophantic agreement. Sophie wasn't sure if she'd just been complimented or insulted. Well, then you'll be glad to know that pregnancy won't change that tendency. I won't suddenly become docile just because you're paying me. I would expect nothing less, Brandon replied, and for a fraction of a second, Sophie could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. Now, shall we discuss the schedule for your medical appointments this week? As Brandon outlined the meticulously planned calendar, Sophie watched him, wondering what experiences had shaped him into this man who approached even the creation of life with spreadsheets and contingency plans. Despite herself, she found she wanted to understand him. Not the businessman, but the person he kept so carefully hidden behind walls of wealth and control. But understanding Brandon Miller would have to wait. First, she had to survive living with him for the next 9 months, assuming the procedure had worked. And as their dinner continued in careful, measured conversation, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement would test them both in ways neither had anticipated. 2 weeks after the procedure, Sophie sat in Dr. Chen's office at the mansion, her heart pounding as she waited for the results. Brandon stood by the window, his back rigid, fingers drumming against his leg in an uncharacteristic display of nervousness. "Congratulations," Dr. Chen announced, looking up from her tablet. "The pregnancy test is positive. You're officially expecting." The air seemed to crackle with tension. Sophie's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, while Brandon's drumming fingers suddenly stilled. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Chen continued, pulling up charts on her screen. "HCG levels are excellent, and all other indicators are right, where we want them. I'll schedule your first ultrasound for next week." After the doctor left, an awkward silence filled the room. Sophie remained seated, processing the reality that she was actually carrying Brandon Miller's child. Brandon hadn't moved from his position by the window. "Well," Sophie said finally, "I suppose this makes it official. Your heir is on the way." Brandon turned, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain. "Yes, thank you, Miss Turner." "Sophie," she corrected, standing up. "If I'm carrying your child, you might as well use my first name." He hesitated, then nodded. "Sophie." Her name sounded strange on his lips, as if he was testing an unfamiliar language. "You should rest. I'll have Mrs. Henderson bring your lunch to your suite." "Actually," Sophie said, surprising herself, "I'd rather walk in the garden. Fresh air would do me good." The doctor said I'm healthy and everything's normal," Sophie interrupted. "I'm pregnant, not invalid. Unless you plan to keep me bubble-wrapped for the next 8 months? A muscle twitched in Brandon's jaw, but to her surprise, he didn't argue. Instead, he moved to the door and held it open. "Then I'll accompany you. The paths can be uneven." Sophie wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful distance between them, but something in his expression stopped her. For once, he wasn't issuing a command. He was making a request. They walked in silence through the manicured gardens, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of approaching winter. "Did you design these gardens?" Sophie asked, noting how each section flowed perfectly into the next. "My mother did," Brandon replied, his voice unusually soft. "She loved creating spaces that felt both wild and controlled. After she died, I kept everything exactly as she planned it." Sophie glanced at him, surprised by this voluntary sharing of personal information. "How old were you when she passed?" 12. Brandon's face remained impassive, but his hands slipped into his pockets, a gesture Sophie was beginning to recognize as discomfort. "My father remarried 6 months later. The new Mrs. Miller had different ideas about the garden, and everything else." "But you preserved it anyway," Sophie observed, "even though it probably would have been easier to let your stepmother change it." Brandon was quiet for so long that Sophie thought he wouldn't respond. Then, softly, "Some things are worth protecting regardless of the cost." They reached a stone bench overlooking a small koi pond. Sophie sat, suddenly tired from the morning's emotions. To her surprise, Brandon sat too, maintaining a careful distance between them. "I should warn you," Sophie said, breaking the silence. "I'm probably going to be horrible at following all your carefully laid plans. Morning sickness doesn't check calendars, and pregnancy cravings don't care about nutritionist-approved menus." The corner of Brandon's mouth twitched. "I suppose I'll have to adapt." "You? Adapt?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "I thought the world was supposed to adapt to Brandon Miller, not the other way around." "Contrary to your opinion, Miss Sophie, I am capable of flexibility when circumstances require it." "Prove it," Sophie challenged. "Let me cook my own dinner tonight, in the main kitchen." Brandon frowned. "We have 3 professional chefs, and I'm sure they're excellent, but sometimes a woman wants to cook her own comfort food, unless that violates some clause in the contract." She watched him wage an internal battle between control and concession. Finally, he sighed. "The kitchen is yours. Though I warn you, Mrs. Henderson will be scandalized." "She'll survive," Sophie said, then added impulsively, "You could join me. Not to eat, I know you have your scheduled dinner time, but maybe just to talk." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie wasn't sure why she'd made the offer, and from Brandon's expression, he wasn't sure why either. "I have calls with Tokyo tonight," he said finally. "Of course," Sophie nodded, trying to ignore the strange twinge of disappointment. "Business, first." Brandon stood, straightening his jacket. "However, my last call ends at 8:30. If you're still in the kitchen, then—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Sophie understood the tentative olive branch he was extending. "I might be," she said carefully, "if you're interested in learning how normal people cook." That ghost of a smile appeared again. "Normal is a relative term, Sophie." He walked away, his posture perfect as always, but something had shifted. In sharing that small piece of his past, in accepting her small act of rebellion, Brandon had shown her a glimpse of the man behind the businessman. Sophie remained on the bench watching the koi swim in lazy circles. Her hand rested on her stomach where Brandon's heir was now growing. But for the first time she wondered if maybe this baby could be more than just an heir. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the key to unlocking whatever Brandon Miller kept so carefully locked away behind his walls of wealth and control. That evening, the kitchen filled with the aroma of Sophie's grandmother's recipe for chicken noodle soup. At exactly 8:35, Brandon appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket discarded. "Tokyo went well?" Sophie asked, stirring the pot. "They agreed to my terms," he replied, then added with the slightest hint of humor, "Though I suspect your soup smells better than their Michelin-starred dinner offerings." Sophie hid her smile, realizing that perhaps they both had something to learn about letting go of control, one home-cooked meal, and one personal story at a time. At 12 weeks pregnant, Sophie stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her profile. The slight curve of her belly was barely noticeable to others, but she could feel the changes in her body. Morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by inconstant awareness of the life growing inside her. A knock on her suite's door interrupted her contemplation. "Sophie?" Brandon's voice carried through the wood. "The car leaves for the ultrasound in 20 minutes. "I'll be ready," she called back, smiling slightly at his predictable punctuality. Over the past few weeks, their interactions had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Shared dinners had become more frequent, their conversations gradually extending beyond pregnancy updates and medical schedules. When Sophie emerged from her suite, she found Brandon waiting in the hallway, engrossed in his phone. He looked up as she approached, his eyes briefly flickering to her midsection before meeting her gaze. "The board meeting ran late," he explained, gesturing toward the exit. "We'll have to go directly to the charity gala afterward." Sophie stopped short. "What charity gala?" "The annual Real Estate Development Foundation dinner." Brandon's brow furrowed. "I mentioned it last week. Your presence is expected." "No, you didn't mention it," Sophie countered, crossing her arms. "And what do you mean my presence is expected? I'm not in any condition to—" "Your condition is precisely Why you should attend, Brandon interrupted, checking his watch. The Foundation's board members are significant investors in Miller Enterprises. They'll expect to meet my... He hesitated. Your what, Brandon? Your contracted incubator? The words came out sharper than she intended. His jaw tightened. This isn't the time for semantics. The car's waiting. Everything's always on your schedule, isn't it? Sophie didn't move. Did it occur to you that I might not want to be paraded in front of your business associates like some sort of trophy acquisition? Brandon ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare gesture of frustration. These people control billions in investments. Their support is crucial for the company's expansion plans. And there it is, Sophie said quietly. The truth. Behind the invitation, it's not about me at all, it's about your business interests. Something flickered in Brandon's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or understanding. He took a step toward her. Sophie. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson appearing at the end of the hallway. Mr. Miller, Mr. Richardson from the board is on the line. He says it's urgent. Brandon's professional mask slipped back into place. We'll discuss this later. The car leaves in 15 minutes. He strode away, already reaching for his phone. Sophie watched him go, a familiar ache in her chest. Just when she thought she was starting to understand him, the businessman would resurface, reminding her that everything in Brandon Miller's world revolved around control and calculation. The ultrasound appointment was a blur of medical terminology and measurements. Dr. Chen pointed out the baby's developing features on the screen, but Sophie struggled to focus, her mind still churning with anger and hurt over Brandon's presumptions. Would you like to know the gender? Dr. Chen asked, moving the wand slightly. Sophie glanced at Brandon, who had maintained a careful distance throughout the appointment. His eyes were fixed on the screen, an unfamiliar emotion playing across his features. Yes, he said softly, then looked at Sophie. If you agree? The uncertainty in his voice caught her off guard. For once he wasn't commanding, he was asking. Sophie nodded. Yes, I'd like to know. Congratulations, Dr. Chen smiled. You're having a boy. The word hung in the air between them. A boy. Brandon's heir. Sophie watched as Brandon's composed facade cracked slightly, his hand gripping the edge of his chair. I'll give you two a moment, Dr. Chen said tactfully, slipping out of the room. In the silence that followed, Sophie wiped the ultrasound gel from her stomach, stealing glances at Brandon. He hadn't moved, his eyes still fixed on the frozen image on the screen. A son, he whispered, almost to himself. Your heir, Sophie said, testing the waters. Brandon turned to her then, and the raw emotion in his eyes took her breath away. I never had that, he said quietly. Had what? A father who... He stopped, seeming to catch himself. The vulnerability disappeared behind his usual mask. We should prepare for the gala. Sophie reached out, surprising them both by touching his arm. Brandon, wait. Talk to me, please. He stared at her hand on his sleeve, and for a moment Sophie thought he might actually open up. Then his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. The car's waiting, he said, stepping back. I'll have Mrs. Henderson bring up an appropriate dress. Sophie let her hand fall, that familiar wall rising between them again. I'm not going to the gala. Sophie. No. She met his gaze steadily. I agreed to carry your child, not to be a pawn in your business games. If you want to announce the pregnancy to your investors, do it yourself. Brandon's expression hardened. The contract stipulates medical care and discretion, Sophie interrupted. It doesn't make me your puppet. You can't control everything, Brandon. Not the pregnancy, not the baby, and certainly not me. They stared at each other, the tension electric. Finally, Brandon spoke, his voice tight. The car will take you back to the mansion. I'll make your excuses at the gala. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Sophie? He seemed to struggle with the words. I'm sorry about springing the gala on you. It was Inconsiderate. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Sophie alone with the frozen image of their son on the screen and the lingering feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. That night, Sophie sat in her garden, watching the stars emerge. Her hand rested on her stomach, where their son, no longer just an heir but a real person, was growing. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made her look up. Brandon stood there, his tie undone, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "The gala ended early," he said, though she hadn't asked. "May I join you?" Sophie nodded, making space on the bench. They sat in silence, watching the night sky until Brandon spoke again. "My father never came to a single ultrasound appointment," he said quietly. "Not for me, not for my siblings. Business always came first." He paused. "I promised myself I would be different." Sophie turned to study his profile in the moonlight. "You already are different," she said softly. "You were there today. You saw your son." Brandon looked at her then, his eyes unguarded for once. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me that moment." In the quiet garden with the stars above and their son growing between them, Sophie realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Brandon Miller than she'd thought. And maybe, just maybe, this arrangement was becoming something neither of them had expected. At 16 weeks pregnant, Sophie found herself in an unexpected position, sitting across from Brandon in his home office at midnight, sharing ice cream while he reviewed quarterly reports. These late-night encounters had become increasingly frequent, though neither of them acknowledged the shift in their relationship. "The baby's craving chocolate again?" Brandon asked, glancing up from his laptop with that almost smile that was appearing more often lately. "No, that's all me," Sophie admitted, licking her spoon. "The baby seems to prefer pickles dipped in peanut butter, but I'm not subjecting you to that particular culinary adventure." "How considerate." Brandon's eyes lingered on her face before returning to his screen. In the soft lamplight, the usual sharp edges of his expression had softened. Sophie shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position. Her growing belly made everything more challenging, including finding the right way to sit. Brandon noticed her discomfort immediately. "Here," he said, rising and retrieving a cushion from the leather couch. He placed it behind her back with surprising gentleness. "Better?" "Yes, thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Then Brandon's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. His expression darkened as he read the message. "I need to take this call," he said, already reaching for his office phone. "It's the Tokyo office." Sophie stood, recognizing her cue to leave, but Brandon's next words stopped her. "Stay," he said softly. "If you'd like." She settled back into her chair as Brandon answered the call, switching effortlessly into business mode. She'd grown accustomed to his different personas: the ruthless businessman, the controlling employer, and increasingly, the almost tender man who brought her chocolate ice cream at midnight. "What do you mean the files were leaked?" Brandon's sharp tone drew her attention. His face had gone rigid. The softness of moments ago completely vanished. "Find out who had access. Every employee, every contractor. I want names on my desk by morning." Sophie watched as he paced the office, his free hand clenched at his side. Whatever had happened, it was serious. After he hung up, Brandon stood at the window, his back to her. "Someone leaked confidential information about Miller Enterprises' latest development project," he said before she could ask, "including details about certain financial arrangements. Is it bad?" "It could be." He turned to face her, and Sophie was struck by the tension in his features. "The Vancouver Sun is running the story tomorrow morning. There will be questions about the company's practices, our relationships with city officials. Your investors won't like that," Sophie said quietly. "No, they won't." Brandon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of genuine distress. "The board is already demanding an emergency meeting." Sophie stood, moving closer to him. "What can I do?" Brandon looked at her with surprise as if he'd forgotten she was there. "This doesn't concern you, Sophie. The contract—" "Forget the contract for a minute," she interrupted. "You're clearly worried, and I'm here. Let me help." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, "Why? Why what? Why would you want to help? This is business, not—" He gestured vaguely between them. "Not what, Brandon?" Sophie challenged. "Not personal? Because I think we passed that line somewhere between midnight ice cream sessions and you memorizing my prenatal vitamin schedule." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Sophie, you don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "Just let me stay. Even if it's just to keep you company while you work through this." The conflict played across his face, his instinct to handle everything alone warring with something else, something newer and less certain. Finally, he nodded. They worked through the night, Sophie helping him organize documents and draft preliminary responses while he fielded calls from increasingly panicked board members. Around 3 a.m., she fell asleep on his office couch, lulled by the sound of his voice as he spoke with his legal team. She woke briefly when she felt something warm being draped over her, Brandon's suit jacket. Through half-closed eyes, she watched him return to his desk, his shirt sleeves rolled up, tie long discarded. He looked younger somehow, more human. "Brandon?" she murmured sleepily. He looked up. "Go back to sleep, Sophie. Everything's under control." "Liar," she smiled, pulling his jacket closer. It smelled like him, expensive cologne and something uniquely Brandon. "But I appreciate the effort." The morning brought chaos. News vans crowded the mansion's gates, reporters shouting questions about Miller Enterprises' alleged misconduct. Sophie watched from her window as Brandon emerged, impeccably dressed once more, to face the media storm. His voice carried across the lawn, steady and authoritative as he addressed the cameras. "Miller Enterprises has always operated with complete transparency and integrity. We welcome any investigation into our business practices." Looking at him now, no one would guess he'd spent the night pacing his office, wrestling with worst-case scenarios. No one would see the man who'd carefully covered her with his jacket, who'd insisted she eat something when she'd tried to skip dinner to help him work. Mrs. Henderson appeared at her door. "Miss Turner, there's someone here to see you." A reporter from the Vancouver Sun. Sophie's heart sank. Of course. It was only a matter of time before someone connected her presence in the mansion to the broader story. A pregnant former employee now living with the city's most eligible bachelor. It was too juicy to ignore. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Don't speak to anyone, my security team will handle it." Sophie stared at the message, feeling that familiar frustration with his controlling nature rise up. But this time it was tempered with understanding. He wasn't just protecting his business interests anymore, he was protecting them both. She typed back, "I know how to handle reporters, Brandon. Trust me." His response came immediately. "I do." Those two simple words hit her with unexpected force. Brandon Miller, the man who trusted no one, who controlled everything, trusted her. Sophie placed a hand on her growing belly, feeling their son move. "Your father's learning," she whispered. "Slowly, but he's learning." Looking out at the media circus below, Sophie realized that somewhere between contract signatures and midnight ice cream, between ultrasound appointments and crisis management, something fundamental had changed. The walls they'd built to keep this arrangement purely professional had developed cracks, and through those cracks, something unexpected was growing, something that terrified and thrilled them both. But as the reporters continued to shout questions about hidden deals and secret arrangements, Sophie wondered if they'd get the chance to explore what that something might be, or if Brandon's carefully constructed world would come crashing down around them first. At 20 weeks pregnant, Sophie sat in Dr. Chen's office for another routine checkup, but her attention was focused on the muted television mounted on the wall. Brandon's face filled the screen as he testified before the city council about Miller Enterprises' business practices. The caption below read, "Miller Empire under investigation." "Blood pressure's a bit high today," Dr. Chen noted, frowning at her readings. "Have you been experiencing any unusual stress?" Sophie almost laughed at the question. The past month had been nothing but stress. Watching Brandon fight to save his company while trying to shield her from the growing media circus. Despite his best efforts, rumors about their arrangement had started circulating in the business papers. "I'm fine," Sophie assured the doctor. "Just tired." Dr. Chen didn't look convinced. "Mr. Miller asked me to monitor you closely. With your pregnancy now showing clearly, the media attention could—" "Brandon needs to worry about himself right now," Sophie interrupted, placing a protective hand over her rounded belly. "The board meeting today will determine everything." As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. "Check the business news. They're calling for Brandon's resignation." Sophie's heart clenched. She'd seen firsthand how this crisis had affected Brandon, though he tried to hide it behind his usual controlled facade. Late at night, when he thought she was asleep, she'd heard him pacing the halls, making endless calls, fighting to save everything he'd built. After her appointment, Sophie found the mansion unusually quiet. Most of the staff had been given the day off, a subtle sign that Brandon expected bad news from the board meeting. She found him in his office, standing at the window with his back to the door. His suit jacket was draped over a chair, his shoulders tense under his white shirt. "I saw the council meeting coverage," Sophie said softly, announcing her presence. Brandon didn't turn around. "The board voted. I have 24 hours to voluntarily step down as CEO, or they'll force a vote of no confidence." Sophie moved closer, her heart aching at the defeat in his voice. "They can't do this. You built this company." "They can, and they will." Finally, he turned to face her. The strain of the past month showed in the shadows under his eyes, the new lines around his mouth. "The scandal has cost us 3 major development deals. The stock has dropped 30%. They need someone to blame." "It's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Didn't I? I played the game, Sophie. I made deals, pulled strings, greased the right palms. It was all legal but ethical." He shook his head. "Maybe the board is right. Maybe it's time for a change." "This isn't you," Sophie said firmly. "The Brandon Miller I know doesn't give up. The Brandon Miller you know?" He stepped closer, his eyes intense. "And who exactly is that? The businessman who bought your pregnancy with a contract? The fool who thought he could control everything, including life itself?" "No." Sophie met his gaze steadily. "The man who brings me ice cream at midnight, who memorized every detail of our son's development, who's so afraid of turning into his father that he's willing to lose everything rather than fail his child." Brandon stared at her, something raw and vulnerable crossing his face. "Sophie, I know you're scared," she continued, closing the distance between them. "Not of losing the company, but of losing control. Of becoming the kind of father yours was." His breath caught. "How do you?" "Because I see you, Brandon. The real you, not the persona you show the world." Without thinking, she reached up and touched his face. "And that man? He's worth fighting for." For a moment, they stood frozen, her hand on his cheek, his eyes locked with hers. Then, slowly, Brandon covered her hand with his own. "I don't know how to fight this," he admitted quietly. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." "Then let me help you make one." Sophie guided him to sit on the office couch. "Tell me everything. Every deal, every meeting, every person involved. There has to be a way to prove you acted legally." Brandon looked at her with a mixture of wonder and confusion. "Why are you doing this? After everything I've put you through, the contract, the media attention." "Because somewhere between your controlling schedules and midnight conversations, between ultrasound appointments and crisis meetings, Sophie stopped, suddenly aware of what she was about to confess. Brandon's hand found hers, intertwining their fingers. "You what?" Before she could answer, their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson's urgent knock. "Mr. Miller, the board chairman is on line 1. He says it's urgent." Brandon squeezed Sophie's hand once before standing, his business mask sliding back into place. But something had changed. There was a new determination in his posture. "Sophie," he said as she moved toward the door. "Stay, please?" She nodded, settling onto the couch as he took the call. As his voice filled the office with professional confidence, Sophie placed both hands on her belly, feeling their son move. "Your father's a fighter," she whispered. "He just needed reminding." Hours later, after endless calls and strategy sessions, Brandon finally set down his phone. The sky outside had darkened, but neither of them had bothered to turn on the office lights. "The chairman agreed to give me 48 hours, Brandon said into the darkness. "If I can prove the leaked documents were manipulated, show that the deals were all legitimate." "You can do it," Sophie assured him. "We can do it." In the dim light, Brandon moved to sit beside her on the couch. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his hand on her rounded belly. Their son kicked as if recognizing his father's touch. "I never thanked you," Brandon said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me, the real me." He turned to face her, and in the shadows, his usual walls were completely down. "For making me want to be better than my father, better than the man who thought he could buy happiness with a contract." Sophie's heart raced at the intensity in his voice. "Brandon, I know this isn't what you signed up for," he continued. "The scandal, the media, the complications. I would understand if you wanted to modify the contract, make arrangements to—" Sophie silenced him by placing her fingers against his lips. "Don't you dare try to push me away now. Not when I'm finally starting to understand what this is between us." Brandon caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her breath catch. "And what is this between us, Sophie?" Before she could answer, his phone buzzed again, this time with breaking news that would change everything. The headline read, "Former Miller Enterprises CFO admits to document manipulation, board chairman implicated in scheme." Bontrick, as Brandon read the article aloud, his voice growing stronger with each revelation, Sophie realized that sometimes losing control wasn't the end. Sometimes it was just the beginning of something far more precious than any carefully laid plan could provide. 24 weeks into her pregnancy, Sophie watched from the mansion's media room as Brandon delivered a press conference that would reshape everything. The former CFO's confession had sparked a chain reaction, exposing a conspiracy within Miller Enterprises' board to seize control of the company. The evidence clearly shows that Miller Enterprises operated within full legal and ethical boundaries, Brandon stated, his voice steady as cameras flashed. The manipulated documents were part of a calculated attempt by certain board members to orchestrate a hostile takeover. As of this morning, those individuals have been removed from their positions and are facing criminal charges. Sophie pressed a hand to her active belly, feeling their son's strong kicks. He always seemed more active when he heard his father's voice, even through a television screen. "In light of these revelations," Brandon continued, "I am announcing a complete restructuring of Miller Enterprises leadership. We will implement new transparency measures and ethical guidelines that go beyond industry standards. This company was built on integrity, and that's how it will continue to operate." The reporters erupted with questions, but Brandon handled each one with the confident precision she'd come to admire. This was the man she knew he could be, strong without being harsh, powerful without being cruel. Later that evening, Sophie found him in the garden, standing by his mother's koi pond. The autumn air was crisp and she wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "The news channels are calling it the comeback of the decade," she said, moving to stand beside him. "The ruthless CEO with a heart of gold, exposing corruption in his own company." Brandon's lips quirked. Hardly gold, but perhaps not quite as ruthless as before. He turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the fading light. "I've been thinking about what you said, about seeing the real me. And And I wonder if the real me existed before you came into my life. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I had everything planned, controlled, measured. Then you happened. Sophie's heart raced at his proximity. I broke your perfect system? You shattered it completely. His hand came up to cup her cheek. And I'm beginning to think that's the best thing that ever happened to me. Before she could respond, their son kicked forcefully, making her gasp. Brandon's other hand immediately went to her belly, concern replacing the tenderness in his expression. He's fine, Sophie assured him, placing her hand over his. Just reminding us he's here. He's strong, Brandon murmured, his thumb stroking gentle circles over the spot where their son moved. Like his mother. Sophie looked up at him, caught by the intensity in his gaze. Brandon, I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Something I should have said weeks ago, but I was too afraid of losing control, of becoming vulnerable. You don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm but gentle. When I drew up that contract, I thought I could keep everything neat and contained. A business arrangement with clear boundaries and no emotional complications. But you changed everything. Sophie's breath caught as his hand moved from her cheek to tangle in her hair. How? By challenging me. By seeing through my walls. By making me want things I never thought I could have. His voice dropped to a whisper. By making me fall in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Sophie's heart thundered in her chest as she processed what he'd said. The contract, she began. To hell with the contract, Brandon interrupted. I don't want a business arrangement anymore, Sophie. I want you. I want our son. I want a real family, not some carefully orchestrated facade. Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. You're not exactly known for wanting messy emotional complications in your life. No, he agreed, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. But I'm learning that some complications are worth every moment of chaos they bring. You taught me that. And what if I'm not ready? Sophie challenged, needing to be sure. What if I need time to trust that this isn't just another one of your business strategies? Brandon stepped back slightly, though his hand remained on her belly where their son continued to move. Then I'll wait. I'll prove to you every day that this is real, that you're not just a contract to me anymore. You're everything, Sophie, you and our son. A memory flashed through Sophie's mind. Their first dinner together after she'd moved in. How cold and businesslike he'd been. The contrast with the man standing before her now, his eyes vulnerable and honest, his walls completely down, was staggering. You really mean it, don't you? She whispered. Every word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. Which is why I want you to have this. Sophie took the paper with trembling hands. As she unfolded it, she recognized the contract that had started everything, now covered in red lines striking through every clause. I don't want to own you, Sophie. I don't want to control you. I just want to love you, if you'll let me. She stared at the voided contract, tears flowing freely now. You know this doesn't magically fix everything, right? We still have a lot to work through. I know. Brandon's voice was steady. But I'm willing to do the work, to take the risk. The question is, are you? Sophie looked up at him, seeing all the changes the past months had wrought. The rigid businessman was still there, but now he was tempered by something softer, something real and vulnerable and beautiful. Their son kicked again, as if adding his opinion to the moment. Brandon laughed softly, his hand pressing gently against the movement. I think he's voting yes, he murmured. Sophie couldn't help but smile. He's definitely your son, always trying to influence the outcome. Sophie. Brandon's voice grew serious again. I know I have a lot to prove, a lot to make up for. But I promise you, if you give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that this is real. She reached up, tracing the lines of his face with her fingers. You already have been, she whispered. Every midnight ice cream run, every doctor's appointment, every time you let your walls down just a little bit more. I've been falling in love with you too, Brandon. I was just too scared to admit it. The joy that bloomed across his face was unlike anything she'd ever seen from him. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, careful of her belly, and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he'd been holding back. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Brandon pressed his forehead to hers. No more contracts, he promised. Just us, figuring this out together. Together, Sophie agreed, feeling their son move between them. All three of us. As the sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across his mother's carefully planned flower beds, Sophie realized that sometimes the best things in life couldn't be controlled or contracted or planned. Sometimes they just happened, breaking down walls and changing lives in ways no business agreement could ever anticipate. At 32 weeks pregnant, Sophie woke to find Brandon's side of the bed empty, but still warm. Their relationship had evolved naturally over the past 2 months, transitioning from careful distance to intimate closeness. The sound of his voice from the hallway drew her attention. I don't care what time it is in Dubai, Brandon was saying, his tone carrying that edge of authority she once found cold, but now understood as passion. This development project needs to prioritize community impact over profit margins. That's our new direction, and it's non-negotiable. Sophie smiled, rubbing her heavily pregnant belly. Their son was active this morning, probably responding to his father's voice. The changes in Brandon since the scandal had amazed everyone. He was still the brilliant businessman, but now his decisions were guided by something beyond mere profit. Good morning, Brandon said, returning to the bedroom. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, but his expression softened as he sat on the bed beside her. How are my two favorite people this morning? Your son is practicing his kickboxing, Sophie replied, taking his hand and placing it where the baby was most active. I think he gets that competitive spirit from you. Brandon's face lit up at the movement under his palm. These quiet morning moments had become precious to them both, a time when the powerful CEO of Miller Enterprises was simply a man in love with his family. The nursery designs are ready, he mentioned, his hand still caressing her belly. I thought we could review them together after my morning meetings. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Mrs. Henderson entered, her usual composure slightly shaken. I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's someone here to see Miss Turner. She hesitated. It's Mr. Reed. Sophie's heart stopped. Alexander Reed, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had shattered her heart 3 years ago when he chose his career over their relationship. Brandon's hand tensed on her belly, but his voice remained steady. Show him to my study. We'll be down, shortly. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sophie struggled to sit up, her mind racing. Brandon, you don't owe me any explanations, he said quietly, helping her adjust the pillows behind her back. But I need to know. Do you want to see him? Sophie studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide. Yes, she said honestly. But not for the reasons you're afraid of. I need closure, Brandon, real closure. He nodded, though she could see the tension in his jaw. I'll give you privacy. No. Sophie caught his hand. Stay with me, please. Whatever he has to say, I want you to hear it too. We're in this together now, remember? The worry in his eyes eased slightly. He helped her dress and supported her down the stairs to his study, where Alexander Reed stood looking out the window, much like Brandon often did, though the similarity ended there. Sophie, Alexander turned, his eyes widening at her pregnant state. You look different. Pregnancy tends to do that, she replied dryly, feeling Brandon's supportive presence behind her chair. Alexander's gaze flickered between them, understanding dawning. So the rumors are true. You and Miller. What are you doing here, Alexander? Sophie asked directly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that once made her heart flutter, but now left her unmoved. "I've been following the news about Miller Enterprises. When I saw your name connected to the company, I had to see you." "Why?" Brandon's voice was quiet but carried an undercurrent of steel. Alexander straightened. "Because I made a mistake, Sophie. Walking away from us, it was the biggest regret of my life. I've changed. My company is stable now. I'm ready to—" "To what?" Sophie interrupted. "To pick up where we left off. I'm having a baby, Alexander. I'm building a life with someone who doesn't see love as an inconvenience to his career plans." "Are you?" Alexander challenged. "Or are you living out some contract with a businessman known for buying what he wants?" He pulled out his phone, showing a tabloid headline. "Miller's $1 million baby deal." Brandon took a step forward, but Sophie raised her hand, stopping him. "You want the truth, Alexander? Yes, this started with a contract, but it became something real, something you never gave us the chance to be." "Sophie, please." Alexander moved closer, ignoring Brandon's warning look. "What we had was special. We can have it again. I can help raise the baby, be a father." "The baby already has a father." Brandon's voice cut through the room like ice. "And Sophie has someone who loves her completely, not just when it's convenient." Sophie reached back, finding Brandon's hand. "He's right, Alexander. What we had, it wasn't real love. It was convenient affection that crumbled under the first sign of pressure. What I have now?" She looked up at Brandon, seeing the love and strength in his eyes. "This is real. This is worth fighting for." Alexander stared at their joined hands, at the way Brandon's thumb automatically stroked her skin. "You really love him? The man who tried to buy you with a contract? The man who learned that love can't be bought," Sophie corrected. "The man who tore up that contract because he wanted to earn my love, not purchase it." She cradled her belly protectively. "The man who's been to every doctor's appointment, who brings me ice cream at midnight, who's redesigned his entire life to make room for this family." Tears filled her eyes as she continued. "The man who showed me that real love isn't about perfect timing or career stability. It's about choosing each other every day through scandals and morning sickness and all the messy, unplanned moments in between." Brandon's hand tightened on hers as Alexander took a step back, finally seeing the truth in their united front. "I understand," he said quietly. I needed to know if there was any chance." "There isn't," Sophie said firmly. "There hasn't been for a long time, Alexander. I wish you well, but my heart and my future are here." After Alexander left, Brandon knelt beside Sophie's chair, his eyes searching her face. "Are you okay?" Sophie touched his cheek, smiling through her tears. "I'm perfect. Actually, I'm grateful." "Grateful? For your ex showing up to complicate things? For showing me how far we've come?" She guided his hand to her belly where their son kicked steadily. "The man I met 8 months ago would have tried to handle this situation with money or power. Instead, you stood by my side and let me handle it my way." Brandon pressed his forehead to hers. "I meant what I said. You have someone who loves you completely now. No conditions, no contracts, no corporate strategies, just love." "I know," Sophie whispered, "and that's worth more than any $1 million deal." Their son kicked again, making them both laugh. As Brandon helped her up, Sophie caught their reflection in the window, her in a simple maternity dress, him in his power suit, both glowing with an emotion no business agreement could ever capture. "Now," Brandon said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "I believe we have some nursery designs to review." Sophie leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his embrace. "Lead the way, Mr. Miller." As they walked together toward their future, Sophie realized that sometimes the most precious things in life came not from careful planning or legal contracts, but from the beautiful chaos of letting your heart lead the way. At 40 weeks pregnant, Sophie stood in the completed nursery, her hands resting on her full belly as she took in every detail. The room was a perfect blend of elegance and warmth, soft blues and grays, hand-carved furniture, and personal touches. That made it uniquely theirs. On the wall hung a framed document, their original contract now crossed out and transformed into an art piece that reminded them how far they'd come. The doctor said we should head to the hospital. Brandon's voice came from the doorway. His usual composed demeanor was slightly frayed around the edges. He'd been on high alert since her first contraction 4 hours ago. Sophie turned to him, smiling through another wave of pain. Your son has impeccable timing. Of course he'd wait until after you close the Richardson deal. Brandon crossed the room swiftly, supporting her as another contraction hit. Forget the deal. You and Oliver are all that matters now. The drive to the hospital was a blur of increasing contractions and Brandon's carefully controlled worry. He'd planned for this moment with his usual thoroughness. Their hospital suite was ready, the best medical team assembled, everything arranged to perfection. Yet as Sophie watched him grip the steering wheel, she saw something she'd never witnessed before. Brandon Miller was nervous. Hey, she reached over, placing her hand on his arm. We've got this. He glanced at her, love and fear mingling in his eyes. I just want everything to be perfect for you both. It already is, Sophie assured him, then grimaced as another contraction gripped her. Though your son definitely inherited your demanding nature. Hours later, as dawn broke over Vancouver, Oliver James Miller announced his arrival with a powerful cry that echoed through the delivery room. Brandon, who had stayed by Sophie's side throughout the night, supporting her through every contraction, cut the umbilical cord with trembling hands. He's beautiful, Brandon whispered, as the nurses placed Oliver on Sophie's chest. Perfect. Sophie watched in awe as Brandon gently touched their son's tiny hand. Oliver immediately gripped his father's finger, and in that moment, she saw something extraordinary. Brandon Miller, the man who once thought he could control life itself, with contracts and clauses completely surrendering to love. Thank you. Brandon's voice was thick with emotion. For everything, for him, for us. For breaking your perfect system? Sophie teased weakly, remembering their conversation in the garden months ago. For showing me that perfect systems aren't what make life beautiful. He leaned down, kissing her forehead. It's the messiness, the unexpected moments, the things you can't control but cherish anyway. Later that evening, after the parade of doctors and nurses had subsided, they sat together in the hospital suite. Sophie rested in bed while Brandon held Oliver, seemingly mesmerized by every tiny movement their son made. I found this in my jacket pocket, Brandon said suddenly, carefully shifting Oliver to one arm while retrieving an envelope with the other. I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Sophie took the envelope, curious. Inside, she found another contract, but unlike their first one, this document was different. At the top, in elegant script, it read, A Promise of Love. Brandon, she began, but he shook his head. Read it, he encouraged softly. Blinking back tears, Sophie read aloud. I, Brandon Miller, hereby promise to love Sophie Turner and our son Oliver without condition or reservation. I promise to value the messy moments as much as the perfect ones, to embrace the unexpected, and to remember that the greatest achievements in life aren't measured in dollars or deals, but in the love we share and the family we build. Her voice broke as she continued reading his heartfelt promises, to always bring her midnight ice cream, to never let business come before family, to cherish every moment of their unconventional journey together. At the bottom of the page was a simple question. Will you marry me? Sophie looked up to find Brandon watching her intently, their son sleeping peacefully in his arms. You know you don't need a contract for this, she whispered. No, he agreed, smiling. But I thought it was fitting to end one chapter of our life and begin another with words of promise. This time, though, the only binding clause is love. In that case, Sophie reached for them both, her heart full to bursting. I think we can definitely reach an agreement. Brandon carefully placed Oliver in her arms before joining them on the bed. As their son slept between them, Sophie marveled at how differently this scene might have played out if they'd stuck to their original contract, if they'd never allowed themselves to feel, to risk, to love. "I love you," Brandon murmured, wrapping his arms around his family. "Both of you. More than any empire, any deal, any careful plan I ever made." "I love you too," Sophie replied, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for letting your walls down, for choosing love over control." Oliver stirred, opening eyes that matched his father's, and Sophie watched as Brandon's face transformed with pure joy. This was the real Brandon Miller, not the ruthless businessman or the controlled executor of perfect plans, but a man who had learned that life's greatest gifts came from surrendering to love. As the sun set over Vancouver, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, Sophie thought about their journey. From a cold business arrangement to this moment of pure love, they had transcended every barrier, every fear, every carefully constructed wall. Their story hadn't followed any contract or plan, but that was what made it perfect. In the end, they had discovered that the most binding agreement wasn't written on paper at all. It was written in their hearts, in their shared dreams, and in the tiny miracle sleeping in their arms. Their love story hadn't just gone beyond the agreement. It had shown them that true love was the only contract they'd ever really needed. Brandon kissed her softly, then pressed a gentle kiss to Oliver's forehead. "Welcome to the family, son," he whispered. "A family built not on business deals or careful plans, but on something far more powerful: unconditional love." Sophie smiled, knowing that while their story might have begun with a contract, it would continue with something far more precious: a love that no document could ever fully capture, and a future filled with beautiful, unplanned moments they would treasure forever. What would you risk giving up control for? A life-changing business deal or a chance at true love? Leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.